Welcome back to another episode of the Executive Code Podcast. I'm here with Nicole, who is a member of our Executive Code community and is also a pilot herself, a very special pilot at that. So I thought I would actually start off with this episode with explaining where the questions come from. You may think that I might be creating the questions and getting Nicole to ask me, which I don't. I'm going to ask Nicole as regards where she gets the questions from or how she comes up with them. Some of them are come from the community and some of her own research herself, but Nicole will explain all of that. But I get to see the questions probably within 24 hours before we actually start recording of the podcast. The only thing I do is determine, can I answer the question? Or what would be my viewpoint? That's the only thing I do when I'm looking at the questions. And if there's a question that I don't know the answer to, I'm not going to answer it because I'm not the expert in it. But as of yet, there hasn't been a question yet that Nicole has asked that I haven't been able to have an opinion on or to have an answer for. So we thought we would just like to share it with you guys, the listeners, in terms of where the questions come from and perhaps maybe the process of what we do in terms of preparing for this podcast. So Nicole, over to yourself in terms of where do you find questions or what's your process?
Yes, Paul. So, every time we record one of these, every 3 weeks, I come up with 4 brand new questions. Sometimes they do come out of thin air. That's how I would answer the question. But more often than not, I would think about what I've done, since we last recorded and what new questions I have. Usually they are unconscious thoughts, just really quiet questions that nag at my mind sometimes. Cool. They're not really like big questions about what life is, what am I on earth here to do, but more like small nudgings for me to ask or, for me to want to Google more about it or to ask you about it, which I can since I come on this podcast. And so sometimes they do take longer. The process is longer than other times. So I think back on the last 3 or 4 weeks, what I've been doing, how I could have made those 4 weeks better, than they went. Anything I could have done differently, any questions that maybe other people brought up that I didn't have the answer to. And, I thought that maybe you would be a good person to answer them. So sometimes I don't have a specific source that I, refer to and develop the questions from, but more often than not, they're from my own personal life.
Great.
And the things that happen around me.
Yeah. No, that's cool. And one of the questions that I see for today is from a post that was put into the community. So we will get to that question, but probably not for this particular episode, but we will get to it in one of the following episodes. And so if you as a listener want to ask particular questions or you want to be part of this podcast, there is a way you can do that. You can go to our website, paulwilliamdavis.com. And if you go to podcast, you'll be able to see how you can actually be part and join in ourselves here with the podcast and get your questions answered directly to yourself. So I just thought we would share how we get those questions. As I said, I get them within about 24 hours before we have scheduled the actual recording itself. So it just gives me a little bit of time to reflect on it and to see whether I can actually give you an answer on it. So let's go to our first question, Nicole. What have you got for us today?
Cool. And I aim to give you the question 72 hours before, but more often than not, it becomes 48 hours or less.
Don't worry about that whatsoever.
So this week I have sort of a rhetorical question, which I think is appropriate since, we're only 2 weeks away from the new year, 2022. And it's, why does time seem to pass so quickly? And, especially as we get older. Because in one of your earliest episodes, you talked about squeezing everything out of life in terms of living out our full potential. So, some people, they might feel that they're on a constant treadmill because, they're being productive, but then time is also catching up more and more with them. So what are some ways to do so to live out our full potential by squeezing everything out and getting the most out of our time?
Okay. So when I first saw this question, I kind of said, well, yeah, in some respects, the older we get, the less time we have. So there's kind of an impetus for us to squeeze more at a time. So you're an awful lot younger than me. So you've got a bit more time for to go than I do. So yeah, in some respects, as you get older, you tend to want to fit in a little bit more into the day. That's one thing. And think of it from the perspective of, when you're going on holidays and you've got a date in mind that you are going to be traveling, and you might be, that date might be set, a year in advance, and you won't do a huge amount of work in that period leading up to the actual holiday itself. But all of a sudden, when it starts to come to a week or a few days, that's when we start to, for one better word, get our act together. And we start getting our bags packed and getting everything ready that we know we need to have. So therefore, we can rush to the airport and get on the plane as quickly as possible. Life, in some respects, is a bit like that. So what I mean by that is, so when we know we've got less time to have for what it is that we want to do, well, then we will try and squeeze a little more into it. There is a law which is referred to as Parkinson's Law, and that is the task fills the time available. So it's, what I mean by that is that the more time that you have to do a task, the task will actually fill that time. The less time you give yourself, well, then the more productive you're going to be. So it's a law that happens, and you'll be able to observe that in a lot of different ways. So whether it be your own to-do list or any actions that you want to get done, or if you've got deadlines and you've got an exam to prepare for, or you've got a deadline to actually meet itself. So that's where you'll be a little bit more productive as that deadline starts to appear. But looking at in relation to getting the most out of life, for some people, they've got different priorities. So it's not necessarily that, my way is the right way. It's a case of whatever they feel is important to them, that's what they want to get out of life. So if that is just from a perspective of, living life, getting a career, developing that career, retiring at whatever particular age, maybe 65, 67, whatever it might be, and so on. If that's what's important to them, that's absolutely fine. For other people, they tend to get a wake-up call. I know I've talked about this on a previous podcast where I refer to the feather, the brick, and the truck. So it's that wake-up call that we kind of just take time out to reflect on what is it that we do want to get out of life. Now, some people feel that, when they get that wake-up call, that they're either lost, they're looking for direction, or they feel that they're just on a hamster wheel. So they're looking at their life and saying, well, actually, there has to be more to life than what they're doing right now at the moment. There's an inner desire, an inner drive to perhaps to make a difference, or to leave a legacy, to do something greater for what they're currently doing right now at the moment. So that brings a level of drive for themselves to actually maybe change what they're doing and then get more out of life of what they want to get out of life. When I'm talking about, taking the most out of life, I'm not talking about, going to, getting as many nightclubs in a week as possible, or doing as many experiences as possible. I'm not talking about that side of things, or to travel all around the world and go to different countries. That's one aspect, and that's absolutely part of it. But for me, it's around, reaching your full potential. That's ultimately it. We've each got a unique individual life purpose to fulfill. And as I said earlier on, some people maybe don't wake up to that life purpose because they're in that mode of each day is pretty much the same as any other day, until such time as they get a wake-up call. But for those that are fulfilling their purpose, they will be intrinsically driven to fulfill that purpose. When they absolutely know for definite and they're clear on what their purpose is, and they start working on delivering that purpose, the more they actually work on their purpose, the more intrinsically driven they are to achieve their purpose. So for me, it's not necessarily around having so many different experiences or traveling around the world. It's about being on a mission. And for me, it's about fulfilling that mission. So therefore, I'm intrinsically driven in order to reach as many people as I possibly can on that mission, if that makes sense. So when I'm talking about pulling or sucking every ounce out of life as much as possible, that's part of what I'm talking about. The overarching purpose and meaning of life is to literally to be your genius you, to be your true, authentic genius you, the true you. And you won't really fully understand that until such as you know each of the aspects that make up the genius you. And we've talked about this on other podcasts as well. But it's also the purpose of life is to experience. Now, an experience is not necessarily just, again, to experience, for example, a picnic on a sunrise or a lovely glass of wine. They're experiences. They're absolutely experiences. And the more you can gather them, the better. But experiences has a much, much deeper meaning. And the more you drill into experience and really what it is that you want to experience, well, then that's part of the purpose of life. It's to live life fully. And the only way you can live life fully is to experience every single feeling that life has to offer. That's what we're here to do. It's to love. It's to evolve. So if we don't evolve and we don't get to a point of love, well, then we haven't literally fully lived our life. And what I mean by that is, in order to fully love, I'm not talking about infatuation with another partner. I'm not talking about somebody that you might fancy. That's not what it's about. In order to know heat, you've got to know what cold is. In order for you to know positive, you have to know what negative is. So you have to experience both sides. And that's fully experiencing. So that's what we're here part of in life. So when I'm talking about how to get the most out of life, it's experiencing every single aspect of life. Just think of it from the point of view of you're here as a soul, as a spirit to experience. So the only way you know is to come into human form, is to experience. So therefore, the only way that you can actually get to that is literally to experience every single emotion, feeling that you can possibly get to. And that's what I mean by pulling and sucking every single ounce out of life as possible.
When you mentioned you don't know heat until you know cold, it brought to mind. So I grew up in Singapore, where it's a tropical country. It's hot summer year round. And growing up there, I actually didn't realize that it was hot because I thought that's normal, right?
Yeah.
And it was only after I moved, I traveled and things like that. And I've been, experienced winters and all that. But it was only after I moved to the US and I experience a whole range of temperatures. And so I mentioned, was it Parkinson's Law with the task folds that, the time available, the time that you give it.
Yeah.
And I think some people may take that as an excuse or a means to say, why don't I leave this task to the last minute, right? Why I have 2 weeks to work on it, but why don't I do it in the last 2 days? Because I'm going to be more productive in those 2 days than I am if I start 2 weeks before I have to do it.
Yeah.
And so, but that's not what we want, correct? We want to be able to be aligned with our purpose and not just leave something to the last minute because we think we're going to be more productive, but make sure that thing is aligned to our purpose and be working on it consistently as, a deadline or submission gets closer.
Yeah, absolutely. So think, let me put it this way. If you've got a deadline to meet, well, then you have to deliver by that deadline. But imagine if you don't know when the deadline is for your own life. Now, what do you do? So if you think you've got perhaps, let's just say, another 20, 40 years to go, well, then you'll fill that time, or you'll allow the tasks to fill the time. But if your life, and you don't know when you're going to be taken from this life, so therefore that brings a little bit of a different clarity on what it is that you want to get out of life. Absolutely.
And most people would assume, they have 80 or 100 years to do everything they want to do, but that's obviously not the case.
not the case for everybody, no, unfortunately. Yeah.
Also drives people.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So especially with the pandemic, these last 2 years for many people have felt like sort of a black hole with little variation in their daily schedule. If you're working from home, a lot of people are now working from the time they wake up until the time they go to bed, because there's no clear division between work and home anymore. And it's a really odd feeling. It feels as if time is going both faster and slower simultaneously. And we talked about my flying earlier, before we started the podcast. And I flew an airplane for the first time in 2 years, for our listeners, for some context. And it feels like I've been gone a long time, but it also feels like it was just yesterday or last week where I flew the last time. So yeah, it's a strange feeling, especially with something as big as the pandemic disrupting everyone's lives.
Yeah. What some things to maybe help listeners is that when you know what your purpose is, as I said earlier on, you're going to be intrinsically driven to deliver on that purpose, because now you've got the clarity and you've got to focus on what it is that you need to do. Now, some people think they know what their purpose is. Some people think they know what their genius drivers are, but they don't. Any client that I've come and met with, their purpose is never the purpose that they think it is never the true purpose, or the genius drivers that they think are their genius drivers are never the true genius drivers. So when you have the clarity on your purpose, well, now you're intrinsically driven to achieve that purpose. But marry on from that perspective, you've got to have an inspired vision in order to fulfill your purpose. You've got to have an idea of what that looks like. You've got to have a picture in your mind of what does your purpose look like when it's fulfilled. What's the difference you want to make? What's the legacy you want to leave behind? Because some people work from, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, or go and work from 1 year to the next year and so on. And it's a case of each year rolls into the other, and it's very short-term based. However, if you want to put a vision together, it's not so much a vision that you want to have for, say, the next 10 years. Think of it from the perspective of what's the vision past your lifetime? What's the legacy you want to leave from what it is that you're doing right now at the moment? And ultimately, the real ultimate question is around, fundamentally, what is it that you want to achieve out of life? So, in some respects, some people believe that, we only have one lifetime. That's what some people believe, and which is absolutely fine. So if we only have this one lifetime, well, what is it that you want to achieve out of this lifetime? So when you start asking those questions, well, then now you get to have an idea of, well, what is it that you want to do in this life? And when you know that, then it's a case of, I suggest to my clients, write a purpose statement. And when you know what your purpose statement is, it's encapsulating the vision of what it is that you want to create. But it summarizes, in effect, your purpose for yourself, which is unique to you. It's in your language, and it means so much to you. It inspires you in order to actually achieve it. But it's literally, that's what you look at, or that's what you bring to mind every single day. And then the question you have in order to make yourself more productive, which is around, okay, so in order to achieve that purpose statement, in order to achieve that vision, well, then what are the actions that you need to take today that's going to get you closer to fulfilling that mission? That's ultimately what you want to be asking yourself every single day. I think Steve Jobs asked a question, or he said in one of his speeches, which was, if you're doing what you're doing today, do you really want to be doing what you are doing today? It was along those lines, but ultimately the question was around, is it going to get it closer to what it is that you want to achieve out of life? And if the things that you're doing right now at the moment aren't getting you closer to fulfilling your purpose, well, then maybe starting to question in relation to how can you get closer to deliver on your purpose? What are the things that you need to take out of your life in order to be actually working on your purpose itself? Because it's only by doing that you actually get to reach your full potential. It's by doing that you actually get to get the most out of life.
So it's not, it's important to not hang on too tightly to a specific timeline, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, but to have that vision of what you want to achieve in your life.
Yeah. And so in some respects, and I just want to clarify, and it's a good question, Nicole, I want to clarify for something, because it's not a case that you put so much pressure on yourself in order to say, well, I've got to have this done by tomorrow. It's not about that. It's about enjoying the journey, because you can't experience life fully if you're trying to rush through life. But think of it from the point of view of have the concept or have the idea that you want to achieve this in the best way possible, but you don't rush through it because you're not going to experience, and therefore you haven't lived life fully. So I observe and I come across a lot of people that try and get through maybe some aspect or some experience in their life, and they try and get past it and get to it, but they haven't actually fully experienced the moments that they're due to experience, and therefore they're not taking everything from that moment in order to use for going forward. And unfortunately, then what actually has to happen is they've got to experience similar moments again and again and again until they actually get to fully experience and take from that moment what it is that you're due to take from that moment. That's where, like, some people will talk about, being present, being mindful, being all that kind of stuff. Part of that, they're right in some respects, but not fully right. Part of it is actually getting to experience every single aspect of the events that show up in our life, every moment in our life. That's all part of what we're here to do.
That's really helpful. As a lot of people start to think about what they've done this year, towards the end of the year, or maybe this is the start of the new year when people are listening to this. But every time we go into a new year, people realize that it's a specific marker, right, for a point in our lives. So it's not just, going from spring to summer to, the next season, but it is a time for everyone to pause and review what they've done for the year and what they want to achieve next.
Yeah. Perfect. So if you want to get the most out of your life, well, then perhaps there's some of the questions that you want to start asking yourself. And if you want to find out more and get the support and the encouragement for everybody else that's within our community, come on over to our community. It's free to join. And we also have a weekly mastermind meeting. And something that we added on to our weekly mastermind meeting recently, based on what the members wanted, was they wanted a little bit more accountability. So what it means is that whatever actions that they're undertaking to achieve within the next week is what they're being accountable for. So therefore, when they come to the next meeting, they have achieved those actions. And the amount of progress they actually make, it's phenomenal to observe just by having that accountability. So if you want to come over, join our community, it's free to join. Head over to our website, paulwilliamdavis.com, and you'll find a link to our community there. It's called the Executive Code, and we look forward to seeing it there. But until next time, I wish you every success.